And so our third postdoc is Andrey Fradkin, who's been a data scientist at Airbnb, doing some phenomenal work on peer-to-peer marketplaces, and he's going to tell us some of the lessons learned. Please join me in welcoming Andrey Fradkin.
All right, thanks for that intro, Eric. I'm really excited to talk to you today about some of the work that I've done and some of the work that other academics have done in trying to understand this phenomenon of peer-to-peer markets. Are my slides up yet? All right, so the outline for this talk is going to be as follows. First, I'm going to talk about what is a peer-to-peer marketplace. What distinguishes companies like Uber and Airbnb from the companies that came before them? Then I'm going to discuss 3 lessons that we've learned from their surprising success. One, the role of the brand is changing. Whereas before we used to think of companies requiring a really strong brand, having huge marketing campaigns, some of that can now be substituted with online reputation. And instead, the companies that really need the brand are the intermediaries that are matching up the buyers and the sellers in these markets. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the importance of flexibility. So this is the ability of Uber to suddenly conjure up more drivers to come pick up people during New Year's when everyone needs a ride home. And then thirdly, the importance of competition on minimizing the cognitive load. So all the effort that people need to undertake in order to select an option to purchase, to the extent that you can minimize that effort, you can compete away against other options. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about future directions. Where do I think the interesting developments are going to be, and some of the unanswered questions about these industries. All right, so what defines a peer-to-peer marketplace? The first defining characteristic is it's going to be an intermediary that uses technology to improve matching between buyers and sellers. So the technologies that I'm thinking about, even something that we now think of as commonplace as the search engine, but also mobile phones and GPS. Secondly, these marketplaces are going to lower entry costs for semi-professional or small sellers. So before, let's say you're a hotel, you needed to buy a building, and you needed to advertise that you're now a hotel trying to get customers from across the world. But now anyone can do the same exact thing. They can take a few pictures of their room, and they can put it up on Airbnb, and anyone from around the world can book it. And then lastly, these peer-to-peer marketplaces, they're going to use information on the quality of the transaction in order to generate reviews and to use other reputation systems in order to make sure that the good buyers and sellers stay on the platform and that everyone else is not successful on the platform. And this is a really important change in how markets work, whereas in the past, we relied a lot more on government regulation to determine who was delivering the quality services. So just going through a list of some of the interesting peer-to-peer marketplaces, the granddaddy of all of them is eBay. So this is where you can take your Beanie Babies and auction them off to people around the world. It's moved on to kind of more complex transactions. So we all know what Airbnb does. There's a lot of interesting development in labor markets. So Upwork is matching people or matching employers with employees from around the world that are doing kind of business tasks like programming. And then in the ride-sharing space, we have Uber, and we have more asset-oriented companies like Relay Rides, which allows you to rent someone else's car for a day or several days. So one thing I want to emphasize is that although we've now kind of accepted that Uber and Airbnb are creating a lot of value, their success has really been surprising. So I'm going to give you 2 quotes. One quote from Pierre Amidar, the founder of eBay. So he says, "About 6 months after I created eBay, I started receiving a spate of complaints. Everyone was complaining about each other." So what was going on? Well, this was before eBay had a reputation system. And buyers would sometimes just not pay the seller, and sellers would sometimes not ship the product to the buyer. And what's phenomenal is that the reputation system actually prevented this behavior from happening to a large extent. And so it solved this key problem. Now you might think that, well, now that eBay has solved this problem, we're going to get a huge explosion of these new businesses. But once again, people were surprised with the rise of Airbnb and Uber. So here's a quote from Fred Wilson, who's a top VC. We couldn't wrap our heads around air mattresses on living room floors as the next hotel room. So these really sophisticated individuals, they still didn't foresee the rise of this peer-to-peer movement. But of course, rise it did. And here we have the growth rates of the number of guests staying in the summer with Airbnb and the number of UberX drivers. And we can see that these companies were negligible even as of 2011. But by now, they're some of the largest players in their industry. So it's just the rapidity of this growth is really remarkable. So what can we learn from this growth? So the first lesson is a changing role of brand. And in order to motivate this, I'm going to show you the results of a search for hotels in the city of Chicago. So there are a lot of hotels. A lot of them are branded, like the Marriott or the Sheraton. And you can imagine in the days before the internet, making a choice between all these hotels would be really hard, even just getting information about all of them. And so the thing that you might do is you might say, well, I've heard of the Marriott. I know that they have a reputation for giving a pretty good quality stay. They're usually located in a good part of town, so I'm just going to go there. And that gave Marriott a huge advantage, and it gave it a lot of incentives to perpetuate its brand. And there were other kind of complementary mechanisms to this. So you might use a guidebook like Frommer's in order to see what are the good options or not. You might ask your friends, for example, what is a good hotel to stay at in Chicago? But these are all, in some sense, quite inefficient compared to the information you can generate from a reputation system. And indeed, that's what these peer-to-peer marketplaces do. They ask, after a transaction, they ask the buyers and sometimes the sellers, did they have a good experience? And then that information is aggregated into a lot of detailed information about the accuracy, the communication, the cleanliness of the stay. And also there's a review text. I mean, I'm sure everyone's used this, but this has really had a tremendous impact on these industries. So here's a plot from a paper that studies hotels in Texas, and it shows how much a branded hotel can charge more than a non-branded hotel. And we see that this number was between 30 and 40% in 2001, and by 2012, it fell to less than 20%. And this is still before Airbnb really took off, and it's before the internet or online reputation sites took off to the extent that they have now. So we can expect the branded premium to have fallen even more. And this is not only for kind of lower end services. So a lot of time we think of kind of independent options as low end options, but we in fact see successful platforms like House for very high end services like home redecoration. See they're charging prices between like $10,000 and $50,000. So if this type of transaction can succeed, that we can assume that this is a pretty broad movement and it's just not just a low-end movement. But you have to be really careful as a firm with these reputation systems. You have to find the right customers. So if you don't find the right customer, you might get these types of reviews. And here are kind of two really famous restaurants, Per Se and Alinea, and Yelp reviews. And so the first one says, Dear Thomas Keller, who's a chef, when you charge an extra $100 for the veal lamb shank, it shouldn't be the size of a cat shank. And then you have Alinea. I think Alinea next can stick their tickets up their butt. They charge a mortgage payment for the privilege to eat in hyped-up restaurants that are overrated. So what's the problem here? These people clearly don't know what a high-end restaurant is and why you'd go there. But when they do go there, they get a bad experience, and they're going to tell future customers about it. So you better just not target these customers, avoid them, so that your reputation stays high. And that's, in fact, the economically efficient thing as well. You want people that are going to value your service to use it. But the last thing I want to mention is that brand still does matter, but it really matters for the intermediary. So you need to, if you're an intermediary, if you're a platform like an Uber or an Airbnb, you need users to trust your reputation system. because if they don't trust it, they're not going to believe the reviews. They're going to go back to the old options. But if they think that your reputation system is really good, that you're really keeping track of quality, then they're going to be more likely to use your platform going forward. Okay, so that's the lesson about the changing role of brand. The next lesson is about the role of market flexibility. So here I'm plotting. This is from another paper that's not mine, but I think is really informative. It's about Uber, and it shows the percentage increase of Uber drivers compared to the baseline. And we can see in the highlighted section, that's when Uber turned on the surge pricing mechanism. And remarkably, people respond to economic incentives. And we get a rise of Uber drivers by 100% in this time period. And that's really important because all these why did the surge happen? Because a lot of people wanted to get rides at that time period. And if those additional drivers didn't come onto the road, then everyone else would have to wait. But now that demand is fulfilled. And so this is a really important lesson from the rise of these marketplaces. If demand varies, you want your supply to vary with that demand, and you want to use economic incentives in order to make that happen. And you can see the same exact phenomenon occur on Airbnb. So here we have the South by Southwest Festival in Austin. This is when a lot of really hip people descend on Austin and need a place to stay. And what happens is, since the demand is so high, the prices are going to rise, and that's going to induce a lot of additional people to list their homes on Airbnb so that they can make a little bit of extra money. And that's, in fact, what we see happen on the left-hand graph. So who are these people that are responding to these additional incentives? They're people that are looking for part-time work, the type of work that traditional labor arrangements did not fulfill. So they typically work part-time. Each week they have a different schedule, so they might have other things they want to do with their time, whether they're students or they're taking care of family. And then there tend to be very diverse. It's not just low-skilled labor that's participating in Uber, for example. About 50% of people have a college degree. And when you ask them why they drive, they really value this flexibility. 73% say they would choose a flexible job over a steady job. And this is especially important for women who say that they want this flexible schedule because of family, education, or health reasons. And I think there's a more broad lesson here. Uber is kind of the first company to really unlock this value of flexibility, but there are a lot of people in the economy that would much rather prefer flexible jobs to non-flexible jobs, and to the extent that companies can enable this, that's a really big success. Okay, so the last lesson from the rise of peer-to-peer marketplaces is going to be minimizing the cognitive load. So what do I mean by cognitive load? So cognitive load is all the research that you do when you choose an option to purchase. It's that difficult choice that you have to make between option A and B. And it's the planning that goes around making that choice. So for example, when you book a hotel room, you also have to book a flight. You have to tell the people you're traveling with what the details are. So there's a lot of this work that needs to happen. And the marketplaces that have succeeded, they've been able to reduce this cognitive load. So just one example is eBay. When eBay started out, it was an auction site. But here, this is a plot from another paper that shows the share of auctions over time versus posted price sales. And we see that it was over 90% in 2003, and now it's less than 20% of all transactions on eBay are auctions. And that's because participating in an auction is really annoying. You don't know whether you're going to win the thing that you're buying. You can't bid on multiple options at once because you might get stuck with two goods when you really needed one. And you just want the simplicity of knowing that you're going to get this good at a particular time. And eBay has been able to adapt to this, perhaps a little slowly, but eventually they got there, and a lot of their transactions are now posted price. And other peer-to-peer marketplaces have similar issues. So on Airbnb, you oftentimes need to communicate with your host before you transact. So here, I was looking to stay in Tahoe. I asked the host whether the place was available, and the host said that actually, no, it's not available because their family was in town. And this is a really frustrating experience for me personally. I had to wait a day. I was planning a trip with other friends, so it just sucked. And it turns out from my research that when people get rejected like this, they leave the platform without booking at all. So they really view this as a high cost and a disadvantage of the peer-to-peer model versus the traditional model. And so online marketplaces or peer-to-peer marketplaces have been adjusting to this. They recognize this problem. So Airbnb has been really promoting an instant book feature where you no longer need to communicate with a host before booking. And similarly with TaskRabbit, TaskRabbit used to have an auction, and now they've moved to an instant booking model. And the last thing I want to mention is that this is broader than just kind of economic incentives. There's really a lot of importance for user interface design. So Jeff Jordan, who's a partner at Andreessen Horowitz, says that the market for engineers is always white hot, but for designers it's hotter. Why is it so hot? Because minimizing cognitive load is really important for these companies. That's how they compete. And to the extent that you can get the best designer, that's going to be a huge competitive advantage. And here I just showed an app called DoorDash, another peer-to-peer marketplace for deliveries. And one of the cool things that they do is they really make it easy for you to understand when your food is going to come to you. And they show all the intermediate steps of when it's picked up from the restaurant, when the order is confirmed, and when the driver leaves to come to your place. OK, so just briefly, I'm going to mention some unanswered questions and future directions. One question is, are these winner-take-all markets, or is there going to be a lot of competition here? So one thing that Peter Thiel says is you always want to aim for monopoly and you want to avoid competition. That's what startup founders are thinking. They want to make a lot of money. But of course, it's hard to defend your market position. And I think there are a lot of good arguments on either side about whether these peer-to-peer markets are going to end up kind of being dominant players or whether there are going to be multiple arrangements that are going to compete with each other. Second question is, what's the role of regulation going to be? There are, I think, three important areas for regulation in the peer-to-peer sector. One is antitrust. So if we do see these really dominant platforms, is there going to be a role for antitrust? Second of all, large businesses have to deal with things like taxes, permits and licenses, labor regulations. But is this really necessary for these peers that are partaking in these platforms? And that's a debate that that the regulatory bodies in the country is going to have. And then lastly, what about the data? So these companies collect a lot of really interesting data about how the economy is working, or with the case of Uber, how people move around in the city. And cities obviously want this data, but of course, customers don't really want the government to know everything about them. So there's this big tension, and it's going to be interesting to see how it gets resolved. And then just two future directions. We've already obviously talked about these today. One is to the extent that people minimize their cognitive load even more when they're just having a conversation with someone rather than using a search engine. You might think that these big companies that are offering personal assistants, like Facebook's M service and the Echo or the Google Home, they might be kind of taking away the interface from some of these peer-to-peer markets, and that's an interesting potential development. And then the other thing is we've talked about two very specific services, ride sharing and hospitality, but of course there are a lot of services in the economy, and we see an increasing number of plays at getting all those other services to become a part of the peer-to-peer model. So Google now has like a cleaning marketplace, and Amazon has a home services marketplace, and there are very successful startups such as Thumbtack that are also in this space. And I think this is a potentially really important development because they're bringing transparency to these markets that previously we haven't had good reputation systems for. We didn't know what the quality was going to be. So with that, I'll wrap up. Peer-to-peer business models are becoming increasingly important, and the three lessons are the changing role of brand, unlocking market flexibility, and reducing cognitive load. Thanks.
stress, which I think is very important, is the reputation system. And that's been an area I've been very interested in for many reasons. I'll just give you a quick example that I use in my class and try to understand how you adjust it. You also mentioned something in passing that you may want to, as a customer, as a business, discourage people who aren't the right kind of customers. The example I use is the Burj Al Arab Hotel in Dubai, by many travel writers, is listed as one of the best in the world. But on the various travel, like TripAdvisor, it's rated number 25 in Dubai. Number 1 in the world, but number 25 in Dubai. So you looked at the ratings, and I looked at one of them, who rated at 1 on a 5-point scale. The problem was this person drove up, or in a taxi, to the entrance gate. They only let you into the hotel if you either are a hotel guest or have a reservation at the restaurant. He didn't and was turned away. And he wrote a scathing review about how badly he was being treated. And of course, how do you deal with that? And you know, some of the reviews you had here had 3 reviews.
Yeah, so you bring up an important point, which is actually a lot of the online aggregators of reviews have different rules. So one of the things is on Airbnb, you need to transact before you leave a review, whereas on Yelp, you don't. And you have these interesting dichotomies. So you have to really understand what are the reputation mechanisms that are affecting your business, and you have to adapt your strategy to those. So in fact, you're completely correct that they should have been kind of more polite with people that didn't have a reservation, because there was a possibility that they get pissed off and they would leave you a bad review. But at least in the case, yeah. But so I think there are actually a lot of interesting design issues that are unresolved in reputation systems, but they're already making a huge difference. Yeah.
One more quick question. Over here you go.
Many of the review systems really serve a secondary purpose or a primary, which is search engine optimization. There's not a lot of transparency in the market about people's ability to filter out the bad reviews, which you can do when you go out and hire a company to put in a review system. So what do you see, there's sort of this conflict between your description of best practice for the platform and what's actually happening in the industry. How do you see that evolving in the future?
I think that if you're a platform that specializes in reputation, your incentive is to earn the trust of your customer. So removing reviews for bad reasons or because someone paid you to remove the reviews is it's really bad practice, and people are going to learn about it and they're not going to trust you anymore. Now there are some sites, I guess, that do this. So like, for example, if you're a brand and you have a reputation system for on your own website, why would you want bad reviews of your own products on it? That might be kind of a weird conflict of interest. But I think as long as you're a brand that has many different sellers, then it's in your best interest to make the information as accurate as possible. But, yeah.
Thanks very much, Andrey.
Yeah.